You should be ashamed of yourself, Emily. The accusation landed across the polished conference table with enough force to silence every whispered condolence that had filled the Carter family estate only minutes earlier. Crystal glasses stopped clinking. Chairs stopped moving. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed louder than before as every pair of eyes turned toward the quiet woman in a navy cardigan standing beside the window. Emily Carter didn't defend herself. She simply rested one hand on the back of an empty chair and looked at the family she had spent 22 years loving as if they had suddenly become strangers. Outside, a steady Oregon rain traced silver lines down the glass while black SUVs disappeared from the driveway, the last guests leaving after Richard Carter's funeral. Inside the room, grief was already giving way to suspicion. Jason Carter stepped forward holding a thick blue folder against his chest like a prosecutor carrying evidence into court. At 32, his tailored charcoal suit and perfect smile had always earned admiration at charity dinners and business events. But today neither reached his eyes. "Dad's inheritance records don't add up," he announced, letting every word echo across the room. Someone moved money before he died, and the only person with access was Emily. A slow wave of disbelief spread through cousins, neighbors, old business partners, and distant relatives who had gathered for what they believed would be a peaceful reading of the estate. Melissa Carter folded her arms and shook her head with practiced disappointment instead of anger, the expression somehow more convincing. "I told Jason nobody wanted to believe it," she sighed. "But sometimes the truth hurts." Emily lowered her eyes for only a second, not because she felt guilty, but because she recognized something familiar. She had seen this exact look years ago when a cashier counted her paycheck twice before accepting it, when a luxury realtor assumed she was waiting for someone richer, when kindness disappeared the moment money entered the conversation. The room suddenly felt smaller, every expensive painting and polished piece of walnut furniture closing in around her. An elderly aunt cleared her throat. "Emily, please tell us this is some misunderstanding." Emily lifted her head. Her expression remained calm enough to frustrate anyone hoping for panic. "There will be an explanation," she answered softly. Jason laughed under his breath. "Of course there will." He slid several printed bank statements across the table until they stopped inches from Emily's hand. Highlighted transfers circled in bright yellow stretched across the pages like accusations written in permanent ink. Several guests leaned closer. One neighbor whispered, "That's almost $800,000. Another quietly replied, "Richard always trusted her." Melissa reached into her designer handbag and placed a velvet jewelry box beside the documents. "We found this in the guest room closet this morning." She opened it slowly. Inside rested Richard's gold watch, his wedding ring, and an engraved fountain pen everyone recognized. A murmur rolled through the room. Nobody noticed Emily watching the antique clock above the fireplace instead of the jewelry. 10 minutes past 3. Her breathing never changed. Jason took another step, confidence growing with every silent face surrounding him. "You took Dad's inheritance, and now you're hiding behind tears you can't even fake." Emily met his stare for the first time that afternoon. There was no fear in her eyes, only an unusual patience that seemed completely out of place. She looked once more toward the front entrance, listening beyond the rain and beyond the rising voices until the faint sound of a car door closing drifted through the estate. Then, almost too quietly for anyone to hear, she said, "Let's wait just a little longer. Someone important is finally here." No one moved after Emily spoke. The silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt deliberate, as if every second carried weight that only one person in the room understood. Rain continued tapping against the tall windows while Jason glanced toward the front entrance with growing impatience before forcing another confident smile. "Still waiting for a miracle," he said, looking around for agreement. A few relatives nodded, but their certainty was beginning to fade. Emily remained beside the chair with both hands resting lightly against the polished wood, her posture calm enough to unsettle everyone watching. Melissa picked up one of the printed statements and held it in the air. "These transfers happened 3 weeks before Richard passed away. $800,000 moved into a protected account." "Explain that." Emily looked at the document without reaching for it. "I will," she answered. "At the right time." Jason shook his head in disbelief. "You always have another excuse." He walked toward the fireplace where photographs from family vacations covered the mantel. One picture showed Richard laughing beside Emily at a small cabin near Crater Lake, both wearing old hiking boots and matching baseball caps instead of expensive clothes. Jason turned the frame face down without saying a word. The tiny movement somehow felt louder than his accusation. An older neighbor noticed and quietly stood the photograph upright again. Across the room, whispers spread like slow-moving waves. Some believed Emily had hidden money. Others remembered the countless years she spent caring for Richard after his heart condition forced him to retire early. One woman softly recalled how Emily drove him to appointments every Friday for almost 4 years without ever missing one. Another remembered seeing Emily close her own bookstore so Richard could recover at home. Memory and suspicion battled each other inside the same room. Melissa broke the silence again. If you are innocent, show everyone your phone. Show the bank messages. Emily slowly reached into her cardigan pocket. Several people leaned forward expecting panic or hesitation, but she simply placed her phone on the table with the screen facing down. There is nothing on it that changes today, she said. Jason laughed. Convenient answer. He picked up the phone before anyone could object and pressed the power button. The screen lit immediately. There was no password request, no attempt to hide anything. Only a quiet landscape photo of the Oregon coast taken during sunset. Jason searched through recent calls. The last outgoing number had no name attached, only a local area code. Who is this? He demanded. Emily looked toward the front door again. You will meet him soon. For the first time since the funeral ended, uncertainty crossed Melissa's face. She glanced toward the windows where headlights briefly reflected across the wet driveway before disappearing behind a line of cedar trees. An engine shut off. Then everything became still once more. Jason noticed the sound and quickly recovered his confidence. Probably another guest who got lost. Emily did not answer. She simply noticed the old brass pendulum inside the grandfather clock swinging with perfect rhythm. Richard used to wind that clock every Sunday morning while humming old country songs and insisting that patience solved more problems than anger ever could. She remembered him smiling as he repeated the same sentence year after year. The truth never rushes because it never has to. The memory settled over her like a warm coat against the cold afternoon. Suddenly the front door opened without hurry. The housekeeper appeared first, looking uncertain, then stepped aside for a man in a dark navy suit carrying a slim leather case secured by a silver combination lock. His shoes left small circles of rainwater across the hardwood floor as every conversation stopped at once. He removed his glasses, looked around the crowded room, and spoke with calm professional clarity. Good afternoon. My name is Daniel Brooks. I apologize for arriving after the funeral, but Richard Carter instructed me that this meeting could not begin until every accusation had already been made. Daniel Brooks did not rush toward the table or raise his voice above the sound of the rain. He simply placed the slim leather case beside the untouched bank statements and rested one hand on the silver lock, as if the room itself needed a moment to breathe. Every face followed the movement. Jason straightened his jacket and forced another smile that no longer looked natural. You are from Evergreen National Bank, he asked. Daniel nodded once. I have managed Richard Carter's personal accounts for 11 years. Melissa stepped closer with visible relief. Perfect. Then you can explain where the missing money went. Daniel looked at her for a long second before shifting his attention to Emily. She returned the glance with the same quiet expression she had carried since the first accusation. It was not the look of someone waiting to be rescued. It was the look of someone waiting for a process already set in motion. The room seemed to notice it at the same time. An uncle who had remained silent throughout the afternoon slowly lowered the coffee cup in his hands. The elderly aunt who first asked Emily to explain herself now watched Daniel instead of Jason. Outside, the rain softened into a steady mist that blurred the cedar trees lining the driveway. Daniel reached into his inside pocket and removed a folded letter sealed with dark blue wax bearing Richard Carter's initials. Before I answer any financial questions, he said calmly, I am required to follow written instructions left by Mr. Carter himself. Jason crossed his arms. Then read it. Daniel carefully unfolded the page. If there are disagreements among my family, allow everyone to speak first. Do not interrupt accusations. Do not defend anyone. Observe who is eager to judge before evidence exists. The words settled over the room like unexpected weight. Melissa looked toward Jason for reassurance, but his confidence had begun to fade around the edges. Daniel continued reading. Only after everyone has made their position clear should official documents be presented. A cousin whispered, "That sounds exactly like Richard." Emily closed her eyes for one brief moment. She remembered Richard sitting on the back porch every Sunday with a cup of black coffee, telling neighborhood children that character revealed itself fastest when money entered the conversation. He had always smiled when he said it, as if it were simple common sense instead of hard-earned wisdom. Daniel folded the letter and placed it beside the locked case. The instructions have now been fulfilled. Jason immediately pointed toward the highlighted bank statements. Then explain those transfers. Daniel looked down at the papers without touching them. "I will. But first I have one question." The room became perfectly still. "Who prepared these copies?" Jason answered without hesitation. "I did. I printed them from records I received by electronic mail." Daniel adjusted his glasses. "Interesting." Melissa quickly added, "The amounts are real." Daniel nodded politely. "Perhaps they are. Perhaps they are not. A printed page does not become official simply because someone highlights it in yellow." Several guests exchanged uncertain looks. The confidence that had filled the room 20 minutes earlier was quietly dissolving. Emily remained exactly where she had been since the beginning, hands resting on the chair, eyes calm, saying nothing. Jason noticed the shifting mood and stepped closer to Daniel. "Are you suggesting I made this up?" Daniel offered the smallest smile. "I am suggesting that Evergreen National Bank has very specific procedures for authentic records, and none of those procedures involve home printers." The words hung in the air as softly as the rain outside, yet they landed with enough force to silence every whisper. Then Daniel placed his fingers on the silver combination lock, slowly turned the first numbered dial, and the sharp metallic click echoed through the Carter house like the beginning of a truth that could no longer be postponed. The first metallic click faded into silence, yet nobody reached for a chair or dared to interrupt. Every eye followed Daniel Brooks as his fingers rested on the second numbered dial of the leather case. The sound of the grandfather clock returned, steady and patient, filling the spaces between uneasy breaths. Jason forced a laugh that carried no confidence. "You are making this more dramatic than it needs to be." Daniel did not look up. "No, Mr. Carter. I am making it accurate." The second dial turned slowly until another crisp click echoed across the room. Melissa shifted her weight and glanced toward the front windows where the mist had almost erased the distant hills. She suddenly noticed something she had ignored before. Emily was not watching Daniel. She was looking at a small framed photograph sitting beside the fireplace. It showed Richard holding the hand of a little girl during a county fair nearly 10 years earlier. The child was smiling at a blue balloon while Richard looked directly into the camera with the calm expression of a man who believed tomorrow would always come. Emily had kept that photograph in exactly the same place since the day it was taken. She remembered Richard laughing after missing every ring toss game until the final throw somehow landed perfectly around a stuffed bear. He handed the prize to the little girl instead of keeping it for himself and whispered to Emily that life was never about winning first, but about leaving kindness behind. The memory appeared and disappeared in an instant, leaving only quiet strength behind her eyes. Daniel finally opened the leather case. Instead of stacks of documents or bundles of bank records, there was only a polished wooden box about the size of a hardcover novel. A brass plate on the lid carried a simple engraving, to be opened only after everyone has spoken honestly. Several relatives leaned closer. Jason frowned. "That is it." Daniel nodded. "This box has remained inside the bank vault for 14 months. Melissa folded her arms tighter. "Then open it." Daniel gently lifted the box onto the center of the table, but made no attempt to unlock it. "Unfortunately, I cannot." Jason stared in disbelief. "You just said you brought it here." Daniel removed a small envelope from his jacket and placed it beside the box. "Richard left very specific instructions. I may deliver it, verify its chain of custody, and witness its opening. I am not the person authorized to unlock it." Every face slowly turned toward Emily. She did not move. She simply reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a tiny silver key hanging from a worn leather string. A quiet gasp drifted through the room. Melissa took one uncertain step backward. Jason looked from the key to Daniel and back again. "You gave her access?" Daniel calmly answered, "No." Richard did. Nobody spoke. Even the rain seemed to pause against the windows. Emily rested the key beside the wooden box without touching the lock. "I have carried this for over a year," she said softly. "Richard told me never to use it until someone questioned my honesty in front of the family." Jason immediately shook his head. "This proves nothing. Anybody could invent a story like that." Daniel reached for the sealed envelope and carefully unfolded another handwritten note. The paper had yellowed slightly with time, but Richard's unmistakable handwriting remained clear. Daniel read every word without changing his measured tone. "If my wife places the silver key on the table without opening the box, then she has honored my wishes exactly as I expected. If anyone pressures her before the contents are revealed, remember their faces, because desperation often arrives before truth." The room became perfectly still. An elderly cousin slowly removed her glasses and looked directly at Jason, then at Melissa. Neither of them seemed able to meet her eyes. Emily stood quietly beside the chair, the untouched key reflecting the soft afternoon light, while somewhere beyond the mist a church bell rang for slow notes, sounding less like the passing of an hour and more like the beginning of a long hidden story, finally returning home. The silver key remained untouched beside the wooden box, while uncertainty quietly replaced confidence around the Carter family table. Nobody reached for the bank statements anymore. Nobody looked at the jewelry resting inside the velvet case. Every object that had seemed like undeniable proof only minutes earlier suddenly looked incomplete, as if the room itself had realized it had judged too quickly. Emily rested her fingertips on the polished chair and listened to the familiar sound of the grandfather clock. Richard used to joke that old clocks survive because they never rushed, and somehow the memory made the silence feel comforting instead of lonely. Daniel Brooks stepped away from the table and allowed the family to absorb what had already happened. He did not pressure anyone. He simply waited, just as Richard had instructed him to do more than a year earlier. Jason looked toward Emily again, searching for nervousness, guilt, or satisfaction, but found none of them. She carried herself exactly as she had when she first entered the room, calm enough to make everyone else uncomfortable. Across the fireplace, an old photograph caught the afternoon light. It showed Richard wearing faded jeans while trying to paint the white fence surrounding the property. Emily stood beside him laughing because every brushstroke somehow ended up on his shirt instead of the fence. A neighbor had taken the picture on an ordinary Saturday that nobody expected to remember. Yet that ordinary afternoon returned to Emily with remarkable clarity. Richard had insisted on doing the work himself even after his doctor warned him to slow down. Halfway through the project, he admitted he was exhausted, and Emily quietly finished the remaining 200 feet of fencing while he sat under an oak tree drinking lemonade and pretending to supervise. He smiled the entire time. Another memory followed it. Winter had arrived early 6 years before, bringing icy roads and power outages across the county. Richard had been admitted to the hospital for unexpected complications, and Emily slept every night in a waiting room chair instead of driving home through dangerous weather. She wore the same blue sweater for 4 straight days because she refused to leave his side. The nurses knew her by name. One of them once whispered that very few people stayed with family members through every difficult hour. Emily simply answered that marriage was not measured during easy seasons. Back in the present, an elderly neighbor slowly cleared his throat. "Richard talked about her every time we met for breakfast," he said quietly. "He always said she made every ordinary day feel like Christmas morning." Another relative nodded. "She sold her bookstore when his medical bills increased. I remember trying to convince her not to do it." Melissa looked down at the hardwood floor without speaking. Jason shifted uncomfortably but quickly recovered. "None of that changes bank records," he insisted, although his voice no longer carried the certainty that had filled the room earlier. Emily finally spoke, her words gentle enough to almost disappear into the steady ticking of the clock. "You are right. Kindness is not evidence. Loyalty cannot be printed on paper. Love does not appear as numbers on an account statement." She paused before looking toward the wooden box. But Richard believed truth has a way of preserving itself. Daniel quietly reached into his briefcase and removed a small folded receipt protected inside a clear sleeve. He did not reveal it yet. Instead, he placed it beside the sealed envelope already resting on the table. There are several items inside the box, he explained. Each one answers a question that has already been asked in this room. Every conversation stopped again. Even Jason stared at the untouched key instead of the printed statements he had once held with complete confidence. Outside, the rain clouds slowly separated and a narrow beam of late afternoon sunlight slipped through the windows, landing directly across the wooden lid and illuminating Richard's engraved initials as though the house itself had decided it was finally time for forgotten promises to speak. The narrow beam of sunlight remained fixed on Richard Carter's engraved initials as though the old house itself refused to let anyone look away. Daniel Brooks glanced once around the room, confirming that every conversation had finally ended, then nodded respectfully toward Emily. She stepped forward without hesitation, lifted the small silver key from the polished table, and held it in the palm of her hand for a brief moment. It was an ordinary key with worn edges and tiny scratches collected through months of quiet waiting, yet every person in the room watched it, as if it carried the weight of an entire lifetime. Emily slid it into the brass lock and turned it gently. The mechanism released with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than Jason's accusations had sounded an hour earlier. She lifted the wooden lid. Inside rested 3 objects arranged with remarkable care: a sealed envelope, a flash drive attached to a leather tag, and an official Evergreen National Bank folder secured with a green ribbon. Nobody reached toward them. Daniel removed white cotton gloves from his briefcase, carefully picked up the bank folder, and placed it on the table between Emily and Jason. "This document has remained in the bank vault since last spring," he explained. "Its chain of custody has never been broken." Jason immediately leaned forward. "Then read it." Daniel untied the ribbon and revealed several notarized pages carrying Richard's signature on every sheet. The first page contained a simple statement written entirely in Richard's own handwriting. "If you are reading this, then someone I loved has already been judged before the truth arrived." An uneasy silence settled over the room. Daniel continued reading. "I moved $800,000 exactly 26 days before my passing. I personally authorized every transfer. I completed every signature. I reviewed every confirmation with my bank manager present. Emily never requested a single dollar. She argued that we should leave everything exactly where it was." The room seemed to stop breathing. Melissa slowly lowered her eyes toward the floor while Jason stared at the page without blinking. Daniel turned to the next document. Attached behind Richard's letter was a certified transfer authorization bearing timestamps, account verification numbers, and signatures from 2 independent witnesses. Every highlighted amount matched the printed statements Jason had presented earlier, but the destination account carried a different name than anyone expected. It belonged to the Richard and Emily Carter Family Education Trust. An elderly aunt whispered, "A trust?" Daniel nodded. "Established to provide college scholarships for local students whose families cannot afford tuition." Emily looked toward the windows where sunlight had finally broken through the fading clouds. Richard had spoken about that dream for years, always saying that the best inheritance was an opportunity given to someone who expected nothing. Daniel continued reading the final paragraph. "If anyone believes Emily stole this money, they never truly understood either of us. We built this together because kindness should continue after we are gone." Nobody moved. The velvet jewelry box, the printed statements, and every earlier accusation suddenly looked small beside the quiet certainty of Richard's own words. Jason finally found his voice. "There has to be more." Daniel looked at the unopened flash drive resting inside the wooden box. "There is." He carefully lifted it into the light. A handwritten label covered one side. "Play only after the letter has been read aloud. Recorded by Richard Carter." Melissa slowly stepped backward until she reached the fireplace, unable to take her eyes from the tiny device. Emily remained completely still, her calm unchanged, as though she had carried Richard's confidence all along instead of fear. Daniel held the flash drive for another moment before walking toward the large television mounted above the bookshelves. He connected the device without speaking, and a black screen reflected every anxious face in the room. Then a familiar voice filled the silence before the picture even appeared. "If you are hearing me now, then somebody forgot that trust is earned over a lifetime, not lost in a single afternoon." The television screen flickered once before a familiar image slowly appeared. and for a brief second it felt as though time had stepped backward instead of forward. Richard Carter sat on the wooden swing overlooking the backyard garden, wearing his favorite green flannel shirt, with a steaming coffee mug resting beside him. The morning sunlight illuminated the maple trees behind him while birds drifted across a clear Oregon sky, completely unaware that this quiet conversation would one day become the loudest voice inside the Carter family home. Richard smiled directly into the camera exactly as everyone remembered him, calm enough to make every person watching forget to breathe. If this recording is playing, then I am probably no longer sitting on this porch complaining about the weather. He began with gentle humor that brought unexpected tears to several relatives. But I know something else too. Somebody is questioning Emily. His eyes seemed to move across the room, even though the recording had been made months before. If you are accusing her of stealing from me, then you never understood who carried this family when I could not. Jason slowly lowered his head, while Melissa gripped the edge of the fireplace without realizing it. Richard continued speaking in the same steady voice that had once settled arguments before they ever became fights. There was a winter when my business nearly failed. I wanted to sell this house because I believed everything was over. Emily quietly sold her bookstore instead and paid every bill without telling anyone. She never asked for recognition. She only asked whether I wanted another cup of coffee. Soft laughter mixed with quiet emotion throughout the room. Richard smiled again before reaching into his shirt pocket and pulling out a folded receipt. He held it toward the camera. This is the paperwork from the day we created the Education Trust. Emily argued that we should use every dollar for local students instead of ourselves. I insisted on naming her as co-trustee because nobody protects a promise better than she does. Daniel Brooks looked toward the documents resting on the table and nodded almost imperceptibly. The recording continued. Now I need to say something difficult. If Jason or Melissa are hearing this, I hope you choose honesty before pride. Money disappears. Reputation stays with you for the rest of your life. Jason stared at the floor while every relative slowly turned toward him without saying a word. Richard paused as though carefully choosing his next sentence. And if anyone brought printed bank records instead of requesting official copies from Daniel, ask yourself why they wanted speed instead of accuracy. A quiet ripple of realization passed through the room. Daniel reached into the bank folder and produced another certified document. For transparency, he said, Evergreen National Bank maintains digital verification logs for every transfer. He placed a single page beside the earlier statements. The official log showed the trust account created exactly as Richard described, along with multiple attempts made 3 days earlier to access confidential information using an unauthorized online request. The request had been denied automatically by the bank security system. Jason's face lost what little confidence remained. Richard's recorded voice filled the silence again. Emily knows none of this because I wanted her protected from suspicion, not burdened by it. I also asked Daniel to delay every explanation until everyone had already revealed what they believed. Character is easier to see before evidence arrives. Emily quietly closed her eyes. She had waited 14 months carrying a small silver key without ever knowing the full reason Richard insisted on such patience. Now every piece finally aligned like sunlight reaching every corner of a room after a long storm. Richard looked into the camera one final time, his expression warm and completely certain. The greatest inheritance I leave behind is not money, land, or accounts. It is the chance to choose trust over fear. If Emily is still standing quietly while everyone else is shouting, believe the quiet person. She has been saving this family for longer than any of you know. As the screen faded gently to black, nobody reached for the jewelry box, the printed statements, or the bank folder. Every eye remained fixed on the empty television, where the absence of one ordinary man somehow carried more authority than every accusation that had filled the house that afternoon. For several long seconds after the screen faded to black, nobody spoke. The silence felt different now. It was no longer filled with suspicion, but with the quiet discomfort of people replaying every word they had said since arriving at the Carter house. The printed bank statements that Jason had placed so confidently on the polished table remained exactly where they had landed, but now they looked like forgotten props from a story that no longer made sense. Daniel Brooks slowly removed his glasses and placed them beside the official documents. "There is one final matter Richard asked me to address," he said in the same measured voice that had never once risen above conversation. Every head turned toward him again. Emily remained beside the chair, her hands relaxed, her expression unchanged. She had not celebrated. She had not demanded apologies. She simply listened. Daniel reached into the leather case and withdrew a thin folder marked Security Verification Report. 3 days ago, he explained, our fraud monitoring system recorded repeated attempts to obtain confidential account information through an unauthorized online portal. Jason immediately looked up. Anyone could have done that. Daniel nodded politely. That is true, which is why the system records more than internet addresses. He opened the folder and revealed a certified report containing device identification numbers, login timestamps, and location verification. Every access request originated from the same tablet computer registered under Melissa Carter's name. Melissa stared at the page as if seeing it for the first time. Her lips parted, but no words followed. Daniel calmly continued. The requests failed because Richard instructed the bank to require dual authorization for any estate information. Without my approval, nothing could be viewed or transferred. An older cousin slowly sat down after standing through most of the afternoon. So the account was never touched? Daniel answered without hesitation. Not once. He reached for the velvet jewelry box that had started the entire accusation. Instead of handing it to Jason or Melissa, he carefully placed it in front of Emily. Richard also asked the bank to photograph all personal heirlooms during inventory verification. Another document appeared beside the folder. Every item inside the jewelry box matched the official photographs taken 6 months earlier. Nothing had ever been missing. Nothing had ever been stolen. The room seemed to exhale together. Jason looked toward Melissa, searching for certainty, but found only confusion reflected back at him. Emily quietly lifted the gold watch from the box and held it in both hands. The leather strap showed years of gentle wear, and a tiny scratch near the clasp reminded her of a camping trip when Richard accidentally dropped it onto a picnic table while trying to teach neighborhood children how to tie fishing knots. He laughed harder than anyone else that afternoon and insisted imperfections gave ordinary things character. She smiled softly at the memory before placing the watch back inside the box. No speech was necessary. No anger remained. The elderly aunt who had doubted Emily first slowly walked across the room and stopped beside her. I should have remembered who you have always been, she whispered. One by one, other relatives lowered their eyes or quietly nodded in agreement. Nobody offered excuses. Nobody argued with the documents. The evidence had arrived with remarkable calm and quietly dismantled every accusation without raising its voice. Jason finally picked up the highlighted statements he had printed and looked at them for several seconds before folding the pages in half. They no longer represented proof. They represented assumptions built faster than trust. Daniel gathered the certified documents into neat stacks, but left Richard's handwritten letter resting in the center of the table where everyone could still see it. Outside, the rain had completely stopped, leaving sunlight scattered across the wet stone walkway leading toward the garden. The reflections shimmered like polished glass. Emily looked through the window and remembered Richard once telling her that storms always make the world look cleaner afterward. As golden light slowly filled the old house, nobody seemed interested in discussing money anymore, because something far more valuable had quietly returned to the Carter family, and it had arrived in the simplest possible form, the undeniable truth that patience had protected what suspicion almost destroyed. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor where suspicion had ruled only hours before, turning every raindrop outside into a mirror that reflected a calmer world. The Carter house no longer sounded like a courtroom. It sounded like a home remembering who it had always been. Daniel Brooks quietly closed the leather case and placed Richard's handwritten letter back inside, leaving only the small wooden box and the old gold watch resting on the table. Emily picked up the watch one last time and gently adjusted the worn leather strap with the same care she had shown Richard every ordinary morning for more than 2 decades. She could almost hear him laughing because she always insisted he would be late if he forgot it on the kitchen counter. Some habits never disappeared. They simply became memories that visited without warning. Jason remained motionless beside the fireplace, staring at the folded bank statements still resting in his hand. The bright yellow highlights that had once seemed so convincing now looked almost childish against the official documents Daniel had presented. Melissa quietly removed the papers from his hand and placed them beside the empty coffee cups without saying a single word. No argument remained. The truth had arrived without anger, and it had left no room for pride. The elderly aunt slowly approached Emily again, this time holding the framed photograph from the mantel. "Richard always kept this one close," she said softly. Emily smiled as she accepted it. The picture captured an ordinary afternoon with fresh paint on a white fence, grass stains on worn jeans, and two people laughing because nothing important had gone according to plan. Looking at it now, she realized that the happiest days of her life had never been expensive ones. They had simply been honest ones. Daniel glanced toward the windows where neighborhood children were already riding bicycles through puddles that had survived the rain. "Before Richard signed the trust," he said quietly, "he told me something I have never forgotten." Every person in the room listened. He said that wealth is measured by what remains after money loses its power. Emily carefully returned the photograph to its place above the fireplace and finally reached for the education trust documents. She did not read the numbers. Instead, she turned to the final page where Richard had written one sentence in blue ink beneath his signature. "Build futures, not arguments." She closed the folder with a gentle smile. "That is exactly what we will do." Several relatives looked surprised. One cousin finally asked the question everyone else seemed afraid to ask. "You are still creating the scholarships?" Emily nodded without hesitation. "Richard believed opportunity changes lives, and I promised him I would keep that promise." Even Jason slowly lifted his eyes. For the first time that afternoon, he was not looking at money, evidence, or inheritance. He was looking at the woman who had remained calm while every accusation circled around her. And perhaps he was finally seeing what Richard had seen all along. Daniel picked up his briefcase and walked toward the front door before pausing beside the grandfather clock. Its steady rhythm filled the quiet house exactly as it had throughout every accusation, every revelation, and every memory. He smiled and adjusted his tie. "Some people believe the strongest voice always wins," he said. Richard believed the strongest truth simply waits. Emily walked onto the front porch as the evening sky opened into soft shades of gold and blue. The air smelled of cedar trees and fresh rain. Children laughed somewhere down the street, and a gentle breeze carried the sound across the neighborhood like a reminder that ordinary moments often become extraordinary memories. She looked toward the horizon and imagined Richard sitting beside her with a warm cup of coffee, content that kindness had once again outlasted suspicion. Behind her, the Carter family slowly gathered around the table where the trust documents rested untouched, no longer as a source of conflict, but as a promise shared by everyone willing to learn from one difficult afternoon. And as the old clock inside the house marked another passing minute, the greatest inheritance Richard Carter left behind proved it had never been hidden inside a bank account or a locked wooden box. It had always lived inside the quiet courage to trust the person who never needed to raise her voice in order to stand taller than doubt.